Hello, all. Today, let's take a quick trip down memory lane and talk about Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams, born on September 16, 1722, is considered to be one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was also a second cousin to President John Adams, the second president of the United States. He was a politician in colonial Massachusetts, a leader of the movement that became the American Revolution, and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was brought up in a religious and politically active family. He was a graduate of Harvard. He also tried his hand at business, but he was unsuccessful. He worked as a tax collector before he became involved in politics. Fun fact, there is a beer named after Mr. Adams, and there's an actual brewery here in Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts. He first became an influential official of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and then he became part of a movement that opposed the British Parliament's efforts to tax the British American colonies without their consent. In 1768, he penned a letter calling for colonial non-cooperation, which prompted the occupation of Boston by British soldiers and eventually resulted in the Boston Massacre of 1770. British historians found a way to blame him for this, of course, and they portrayed him in the first half of the 20th century as a master of propaganda who provoked mob violence to achieve his goal. But accounts written in the 19th century praised him as someone who had been steering his fellow colonists towards independence long before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Continued resistance to British policy resulted in the 1773 Boston Tea Party and the coming of the American Revolution. Adams was actively involved with colonial newspapers, publishing accounts of colonial sentiments over British colonial rule, which were fundamental in uniting the 13 colonies at the time. Now, a little background on his personal life. He was born in Boston, of course. He was one of 12 children born to Samuel Adams and Mary Adams, and only 3 of his siblings lived past their 3rd birthday. Mr. Adams was proud of his Puritan heritage and emphasized Puritan values in his political career, especially virtue. His parents were devout members of the Old South Congregational Church. His father, Samuel Adams Sr., was a merchant, a church deacon, and yes, a politician. Mr. Adams Sr. rose through the political ranks, becoming a justice of the peace, a selectman, and a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, as his son would later on in life. Samuel Adams Jr. was a college graduate of Harvard, as mentioned before, and he also earned a master's degree in 1747. So he was a highly educated man. Samuel Adams Jr.'s interest in politics might have something to do with a little scandal between his father, Samuel Adams Sr., and the House of Representatives. Samuel Adams Jr. found himself, after his father's death, fighting the government to defend the family estate from seizure. Why, you ask? I will gladly tell you. Okay, it all started in 1739. Massachusetts was facing a serious currency shortage, and Deacon Adams and the Boston Caucus created a land bank, which issued paper money to borrowers who mortgaged their land as security, The land bank was generally supported by the citizenry and the Popular Party, which dominated the House of Representatives, the lower branch of the General Court. Opposition to the land bank came from the more aristocratic Court Party, who were the supporters of the royal government, Jonathan Belcher, and controlled the Governor's Council, the upper chamber of the General Court. The Court Party used its influence to have the British Parliament dissolve the land bank in 1741. Guess what happened? Directors of the land bank, including Deacon Adams, Samuel Adams Sr., became personally liable for the currency still in circulation, payable in silver and gold. Lawsuits over the bank persisted for years, even after the deacon's death. So, for his son, Samuel Adams Jr., these lawsuits and what happened served as a constant personal reminder that Britain's power over the colonies could be exercised in arbitrary and destructive ways. So this was more than just let's just overthrow the British government. This was personal because he was personally affected by it. When his father died in 1748, Samuel Adams was given the responsibility of managing the family's affairs. In October 1749, he married Elizabeth Checkley, his pastor's daughter. Elizabeth gave birth to 6 children over the next 7 years. Wow. But only 2 lived to adulthood, Samuel and Hannah. In July 1757, Elizabeth died soon after giving birth to a stillborn son. Adams remarried in 1764 to another Elizabeth, Elizabeth Wells, but had no other children. Now, the conflict with Great Britain that would eventually lead to the American Revolution started in 1763, right after the British Empire won the war in the French and Indian War. They became deeply in debt, and the British Parliament found itself looking for new sources of revenue. And they thought, well, why not tax the colonies of British America? And of course, Mr. Adams began using the Boston Gazette, writing essays criticizing the fact that the colonies were being taxed without representation. Criticisms gave way by 1775 to Mr. Adams openly advocating for independence from Britain. Taxation from the British government continued in different forms, and Samuel Adams, with other founding fathers and revolutionary heroes, continued to fight them. The first one is the Sugar Act, which they argued was unconstitutional because, again, the colonies were not represented in Parliament. You cannot tax us where we are not represented. And then there's the Stamp Act, which was, again, the British government trying to have the colonies pay taxes on printed materials. Again, Adams and others argue it's unconstitutional, and he actually called for a boycott of British goods to put pressure on Parliament to repeal this tax. By 1768, 2 regiments disembarked in Boston, and by November 2 more came. Boston was officially under occupation, British occupation. They were here to enforce the law or to just put down any resistance or anyone who opposed it. It was going to be their way or the highway. Bostonians responded with a boycott, which lasted until two of the regiments were removed, but the other two remained. Bostonians were still not happy. Tensions escalated between the civilians and the soldiers. That resulted in the killing of 5 civilians and what is known as the Boston Massacre of March 1770. There are people who say that Adams deliberately provoked the incident in order to push his agenda of American independence. There's no proof of this. It's really hearsay. The Boston Massacre, Adams and other town leaders met with the governor and the army commander to demand the withdrawal of the troops. He also asked that the soldiers be put on trial. He even asked his cousin, John Adams, who would later become the second president of the United States, he wasn't at the time, to defend the soldiers because he wanted people who would not slander Boston while being fair. But he was unhappy with the outcome of the trials because he thought that the soldiers should have been convicted of murder. So these tumultuous periods are followed by what is called a quiet period. During this time, in April 1770, Parliament repealed the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea. Adams wanted to continue the boycott, but cities like New York and Philadelphia have had enough. The economic conditions have improved. They abandoned the boycott. So Massachusetts could not keep up, so they had to abandon the boycott also. So I guess disappointed, Adams withdrew from political life for a minute, and things just went on okay for now. So something called the struggle over the power of the purse would bring Mr. Adams back from retirement, so to speak. Traditionally, the Massachusetts House of Representatives paid the salaries for the governors, lieutenant, superior court judges. From the Whig perspective, this arrangement was an important check on executive power, keeping royally appointed officials accountable to democratically elected representatives. In 1772, guess what the British Empire did? Massachusetts learned that those officials would, from now on, be paid by the British government rather than by the province. To protest this, Adams and his colleagues came back out of retirement and went right back to protesting. It was unacceptable. Let's talk about what would lead up to the well-known Boston Tea Party. Remember, all taxes have been repealed by this time except for taxes on tea. So, in May 1777, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, a tax law to help the struggling East India Company, one of Great Britain's most important commercial institutions. Britons could buy smuggled Dutch tea more cheaply than the East India Company's tea because of the heavy taxes imposed on tea imported into Great Britain. So, the East India Company found itself with a surplus of tea it could not sell. What did the British government do? Well, let's just sell it to the colonies. So the Tea Act, enacted by the British government, permitted the East India Company to export tea directly to the colonies for the first time. What's the problem, you say? Well, it bypassed most of the merchants who had previously acted as middlemen. This measure was a threat to the American colony economy because it granted the tea company a significant cost advantage over local tea merchants and even over local tea smugglers, driving them out of business. So no one was winning in this. The act also reduced the taxes on tea paid by the company in Britain, but kept the controversial Townshend duty on tea imported in the colonies. Furthermore, the taxes on the tea by the East India Company would be used to pay the officials here in the colonies, instead of having those officials, their salaries coming from the people they are actually governing. Interestingly enough, every other colonies except for Massachusetts were able to protest and have the teas shipped back to England. But in Boston, the governor at the time, Governor Hutchinson, was determined to hold his ground. And that might have something to do also with the fact that two of his sons were the tea consignees. So the Boston people held a meeting. They asked the governor, have the tea go back. We don't want it. The governor say no. The tea is here. You're going to pay taxes, and the tea will be delivered. Long story short, that evening, a group of 30 to 130 men boarded the three vessels that carried the tea, some of them thinly disguised as Indians. They dumped all 342 chests of tea into the water over the course of 3 hours. Adams never said, it was never said whether or not Adams himself was present, but he quickly defended the act and publicized it by writing his essays. He was good at writing essays, and I'm guessing publish it in the Boston Gazette, since that seems to be his favorite outlet to get his message to the public. The response from Great Britain was quick and severe. Great Britain responded with the coercive acts. It's a set of 3 acts. The first one was the Boston Port Act, which closed Boston's commerce until the East India Company had been repaid for the destroyed tea. The second act, it's the Massachusetts Government Act, which rewrote the Massachusetts Charter, making many officials royally appointed rather than elected, and severely restricting the activities of town meetings. The third act, the Administration of Justice Act, allowed colonists charged with crimes to be transported to another colony, and get this, to even Great Britain for trial. A new governor was appointed, and he was actually a commander of the British military forces in North America. So things were changed drastically almost overnight. Of course, John Adams, along with the other revolutionary heroes, were not children. These were hardened politicians. They almost expected Great Britain to react that way. So they met, and they continued to encourage the boycott. They met, and Adams headed a committee with the doors locked to prevent the new elected governor Thomas Gage from dissolving the meeting. And he proposed an intercolonial Congress, and that was to take place in Philadelphia. So the first Continental Congress was to take place in Philadelphia, and John Adams was selected. Him along with others, I believe he was one of five delegates chosen, and he was so poor that his friends had to contribute to buy him decent clothes and pay for his journey to Philadelphia. This meeting was very successful. Adams used all his political skills to gain more delegates, and Congress issued a Declaration of Rights that denied the Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies, and they organized a colonial boycott known as Continental Association. Samuel Adams returned to Massachusetts. He continued to preside over meetings, Boston town meetings, despite the Massachusetts Government Act. John Hancock was added to the delegation. That there was a second delegation that was to take place again in Philadelphia. So John Hancock and Samuel Adams were the two men chosen to go. But the second meeting would not go as smoothly as the first one. It is also worth noting that from the first meeting, a militia was formed by the people here in Boston, and along with the collaboration of those in Philadelphia. It consisted of militiamen who were to be ready for action on a moment's notice. So it was more than just talk at this point. It was forming militia in case of combat. Well, the British government wasn't having it. So they ordered the newly appointed governor, the royally appointed governor, Governor Gage, to send out soldiers to destroy military supplies that the colonists had stored in Concord, Massachusetts. And they also singled out John Hancock and Samuel Adams, saying that, you know, they were the ones who were instigating violence, and the troops were to pursue everyone, were to leave everyone alone, destroy the guns, gunpowders, and everything, and leave the general population alone, but single out John Hancock and Samuel Adams. So now, outside of Massachusetts, Samuel Adams continued to encourage the war effort. A lot of colonies actually started to replace their old governments with independent Republican governments. So he praised them, encouraged them. And once the majority, the tide started to turn, the people are getting more and more invested in the idea of a full-on revolution. Mr. Adams called for loyalists. Loyalists are people who were probably born in the colonies, but they supported Britain rules. He asked for them to be banned from Massachusetts, and they were banished. 300 of them were banished, and their properties were confiscated. Even after the war, John Adams opposed allowing loyalists to return to Massachusetts, fearing they would work to undermine the new Republican government that they have worked so hard to establish. Adams was the Massachusetts delegate appointed to the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation, the plan for the colonial confederation, with its emphasis on state sovereignty. The articles reflected Congress' wariness of a strong central government, a concern shared by Adams. Like others at the time, Adams considered himself a citizen of the United States while continuing to refer to Massachusetts as his country. After much debates, the articles were sent to the states for ratification in November 1777. From Philadelphia, Adams urged Massachusetts to ratify, which it did. Adams signed the Articles of Confederation with the other Massachusetts delegates in 1778, but they were not ratified by all states until 1781. Adams returned to Boston in 1779, where they drafted the Massachusetts Constitution, which was amended by the convention and approved by voters in 1780. The new constitution established a republican form of government with annual elections and the separation of powers, check and balances. It reflected Adams' belief that a state is never free except when each citizen is bound by no law whatever that he has not approved of, either directly or through his representatives. Now, by modern standards, the new constitution was not really democratic, as Adams, like his peers, believed that only free males who owned property should be allowed to vote. So that excluded all the slaves. And that the Senate and the governor served to balance any excesses that might result from majority rule. Adams returned to Boston again in 1781. He never left, but when he came back, he found that his home on Purchase Street in Boston was destroyed. They destroyed the window panes. They trampled on his garden. They wrote insults on the walls of his house. He was unable to repair the home, so he just moved his family to Dedham, Massachusetts. Samuel Adams died in October 2nd, 1803. Of his 2 living children, only Hannah, the girl, married and had children, so all of his known descendants are through her. He never had children by his second wife. And that's the end. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and subscribe. Thank you. Bye-bye.